International Relations at the Political Science Department of Busan National University in Korea. Thank you for being with us, Bob. Before we talk about the legitimate industry, if I can call it that, the government-led defense industry, let me just talk a little bit about this UN arms treaty in the Asian context and ask you whether you think there's a particularly solid reason why not a single country in Asia has ratified this deal.
Yeah, I mean, the concern, in a word, it's China, right? I mean, China's growing quickly. China's modernizing its military. China's now the world's second largest defense spender. It spends about one-third what the United States does, which is close to $200 billion a year now. And states around China are nervous, not surprisingly. And so they're going to be wary, I think, generally speaking, of putting any kind of meaningful constraint on what they're allowed to import and what they're allowed to use those imports for. I don't think Asian states actually need to worry about it that much. Asian states are actually very well governed, and the treaty really aims to prevent the export of weapons to failed states where they might be caught up and used by rebels and pirates and drug dealers and things like that. So I don't actually think that places like Vietnam and South Korea have very much to worry about. But, you know, states get very, very nervous. They get very jittery about ceding any kind of sovereignty to a supranational body they can't control. And a lot of the Asian states have security concerns, not just about China, but that's one of the big ones. So,
well, look, there are two issues here. One is the threat from China and the legitimate government-level response to that. Let's put that aside for a minute. Get to that in a second. But the secondary element is what you're talking about, the worry that somehow they might be missing something here. I don't understand how that worry arises. This has been debated in the UN for many, many years. Most countries have signed on to the basic idea of it. And the premise is very simple. All it says is we're going to try our best to stop guns from falling into the wrong hands. I mean, how can any government, you mentioned Vietnam, for instance. Okay, let's put Vietnam aside. Let's look at Singapore. Let's look at Korea. Countries with very advanced government, almost developed country status, certainly in the case of Korea. These issues are surely fairly peripheral, aren't they, these concerns?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I actually don't find any particular strong reason to vote against the treaty. I actually think it's probably a good idea for many of the reasons you probably think as well. It helps to curb the limit of unregulated weapons in the conflict zones. That's what the real moral driver is. That's what the NGO community wants this for and things like that. But I mean, we know that states obsess over sovereignty. We know that states obsess over these really, really minor details. I can give you sort of one example in the Korean context. The Koreans and the Japanese have been involved in this very long dispute over an uninhabited little island, a tiny little rock known as Dokdo in Korea, Leoncourt rocks in the more general parlance, and it has brought Korea and Japan almost to blows, and there's almost nothing there. It's very, very minor, but it's really, really important. States really, really obsess about these kinds of details, and for states in Asia that face military threats or concerns about military threats, there's no upside to voting for the treaty. Right? There's downside, like you say, but I don't think they see any upside.
All right. Let's move on to a slightly different angle, and let me propose to you what might sound a little bit like a conspiracy theory, and tell me if it is. The United States and the United Kingdom make an awful lot of money out of the legitimate global arms industry. In some cases, you might think that there may be some people in governments there who'd rather not see too much attention being paid to the way the arms business is conducted. Is there any sense that perhaps even though the US has signed on to this UN treaty, they may behind the scenes be saying, okay, you know, we don't have to move too fast on this stuff?
I would probably say there's a fair amount of that. I mean, the weapons industry makes a great deal of money. I wouldn't say that it manipulates foreign policies. I think that's a bridge too far. But, I mean, clearly the weapons industries in the West generate a lot of revenue. I mean, the Western weapons are very, desired around the world. I mean, they're certainly better than former East Bloc weapons and stuff like that. That was one of the deciding factors in the end of the Cold War, things like that. So I'm not actually surprised that Western governments are sort of halting, particularly the United States. But I should also say in defense of the United States that America has a lot of treaty arrangements with countries around the world that involve what we call interoperability. That means that allies use American weapons so that allies and American forces can work together more smoothly. And the United States has been extraordinarily sensitive to any kind of constraint on what it can transfer to states that it considers allies or semi-allies. And I'm thinking now like the Vietnamese you mentioned before. And then also the other issue in the United States, which we haven't brought up, is the domestic gun lobby, which is extraordinarily sensitive to these kinds of things. So I would put the defense industry into one concern, but put it up against at least two others.
Well, what do you think is the, I guess, the responsibility, if you like, or at least the role of the arms industry, not necessarily the government side of it, but the private side of it, in propagating the problems that we see in illegitimate weapons arenas? How much can we hold them responsible for actually allowing their product to get into the hands of warlords, of criminals?
I would say there's a particular regional burden in Africa. I've been to Africa. I've actually been to Southern Africa extensively. And there you really can see there is just a wash. I mean, the continent, the subcontinent, southern part of the continent is just awash in weapons. Actually, a lot of them are Soviet bloc, by the way. And there you really can see you just open arms transfers and stuff. It's really not that difficult to find. In more established states, again, in places like Asia where you and I are, it's really not such a big concern because you have governments that actually control their police forces and control their militaries. And when they do have insurgencies, like in the Philippines, they tend to be minor and eventually brought under control. But in places like Africa where you have several dozen states that are what we would call failed, where the governments really don't exist beyond the capital, there I do think that this is where the treaty is really needed. Like I said, I think Africa and the NGO community's focus on Africa is probably the driver, because they want to prevent companies from selling, like you said, to governments that are so shaky that they're basically a cipher for local warlords. And there, yeah, I do agree with you. The companies should exercise greater restraint.
Let me give you a couple more examples. I mean, the situation in the Middle East has always involved an element of real weapons from the West finding their way into the hands of people like the Taliban. The Taliban were using US-made weapons for years after the Russians left the country. In the Ukraine recently, we had this ridiculous situation where people were advertising US meals ready to eat from the US military, brand new equipment arriving in the country and suddenly appearing on the private market. And that happens with weapons too. Where is the responsibility here for, when people like Western countries decide to give military aid to their allies, where's the responsibility for making sure that military aid doesn't seep away into unknown hands?
Yeah, and I agree with that, and that's where the treaty is supposed to begin to sort of nail this down, to actually try to get like some kind of registry and some kind of sort of like import and export documentation, so that when these things pop up later, we can say, hey, wait, there was a chain of ownership and somewhere it sort of slipped out. As you said, in the past, frequently these things just kind of slide onto the black or the gray mark and they pop up later and we're all surprised. The treaty is to try to nail that down. I support that myself. I can understand why governments who are sort of interested in making sure that, they can transfer things to group without having their fingerprints on it, they might like that. If you think about, for example, the American support for the rebels in Syria, right? The U.S. government doesn't actually want its fingerprints on this too much, so it might actually want these kind of black and gray networks where things can sort of slide around. That's probably why you're getting some opposition. And then, like you said, the weapons companies, they have no financial interest whatsoever in documentation.
All right, a vexed question indeed. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Robert Kelly from Busan then. And that's it for this program for today. On Wednesday on Between the Lines, we'll talk about changing course, the economic and environmental ramifications for Japan